intervals. Now, an interval is the distance between two notes, like this. So an interval can be a second, or a third, or a fourth, or a fifth, a sixth, a seventh, or an octave. So if we look at this one here, we can see that these two notes are close together. Second, but increasingly they're becoming further apart. So these notes are 5 notes apart from each other until we get to this one here. Two notes are very far apart. In fact, they're an octave away from each other. So you may be asked to identify the interval between two notes. And here's how we do it. So to work out an interval, we'll look at the two notes here. We decide which one of these two notes is the lowest note. In other words, which is furthest down to the bottom of the stave. It's this one here. And we can see that that's an F. Now we call the lowest note number 1. So having identified this is the lowest note, we call that number 1. And then simply we count up until we reach the other note. So if that's 1, we know that this is a C. Then we simply count up. G would be 2, A, B would be 4. We get to C, and that's number 5. This interval is a fifth. How about this one? Applying the same principle, we look for the lowest note. In this case, again, it's the first one here, it's this one. We know that's a G. We call that lowest note number 1. And we just simply count up until we reach the second note. So we know this is a B. G's 1. A is 2, it's not A. It's B, the second note. That's a third. How about these ones? If you were asked to find the interval between these two notes, for example, first of all identify the lowest note, which is this one here. What's the letter name of that lowest note? It's a D. Here's the other one. That's a G, as you know. Call D number 1. Count up. So D's 1, E's 2, F's 3, G, which is the one we're after, is 4. That interval's a fourth. So we're just simply moving our way up the alphabet. How about this one here? Again, we're looking at the two notes. We can see that the first one's the lowest. That's the one we're going to call number 1. That's a C. We'll look at the second one. That's also a C. And even the fact that the two letter names are identical should give you a clue as to what the answer is here. What we call the C here, number 1. And then we count up until we get to this second C. So C's 1, D's 2, E's 3, F's 4, G's 5, A's 6, B's 7, and C is 8, or octave. Remember, there's 8 notes in an octave. So the interval between this note here and this note here is an octave. Don't worry if sharps or flats appear before any of the notes. That doesn't affect the number that you're going to give of that interval. So these two notes, for example, we look at the lowest one, which is this one. We know that's a C. We know this note is an F sharp, but forget about the sharps. Just call it F for the purposes of finding the interval. So C's number 1, D's number 2, E's number 3, F's number 4. That interval, still a fourth. Here's one that uses a flat this time. This is the lowest note. That's number 1. That's a C. Here's the other note. It's a B flat. You can forget about the flat though, as long as you're remembering the letter B. So C's 1, D's 2, E's 3, F's 4, G's 5, A's 6, B 7, B flat. Still a seventh. Doesn't matter about the sharps and flats. Sometimes though the first note isn't the lowest note. Look at these. You may be asked to decide on the interval between these two notes, or these two, or these two. And that doesn't matter. We still apply the same principle as before. We always call the lowest note, not the first note, the lowest note of the two. That's number one. And we count up until we reach the second note. So for example, here we can see that the lowest note is this one. That's a G, and that's going to be number one. The lowest note is number one. Here's the other note. That's a C. So we're going to count, calling G number one, we're going to count up until we reach C. So G's 1, A's 2, B's 3, and C's 4. So that's making that interval a fourth. Again, if we look at this example, we see that the lowest note is here, and this is an A. And the other note here, it's higher up, that's an F. So we're going to call the lowest note here number 1. So A's 1, B's 2, C's 3, D's 4, E's 5, F. That's the one we're after. F is number 6. So that is a sixth. In this example, they're pretty close together, so we know it's going to be a small number. Here's the lowest note here, and that's the one that's furthest down towards the bottom of the stave. So we're going to call this note here, which is D, we call this number 1. I'm going to count up until we reach the second note, which is an E, not very far. So D's 1, E's 2, and that's the one we're after. And that's why that interval is a second. How about these ones? So again, we're looking for the lowest note of the two, which is this one. We know that's an F. That's the one we're going to call number 1. Here's the other note. We know that's a B flat. We don't need to bother about the flat though, we've spoken about that before. So we're looking for the interval between an F and a B. So F's number 1, G's number 2, A's number 3, B flat or B would be number 4, and that's why that interval is a fourth. These two here, again we see a sharp, doesn't matter about that. We're looking for the lowest of the two notes, which is this one here. We know that's an E. E's number 1. I'm going to count up until we get to this note, which is F sharp, or F would do. So if E's 1, F sharp is 2. That's why that interval is a second. What about this one? Again, we can see that the lowest of the two notes is here. We know that note there is a G. I'm going to call that G number 1. This note here is also a G. If you know that, you already know what the interval is without counting. But let's go through. G's number 1, A's 2, B's 3, C's 4, D's 5, E's 6, F's 7, and G is 8. And it's that one we're after. So there's 8 notes between this G and this G, and we call that an octave. These two notes here, so again we look for the lowest note. Here's the lowest note here, I'm calling that number 1, G. G's number 1, and we are looking for this note here, which is an F. So if G's 1, A's 2, B's 3, C's 4, D's 5, E's 6, and F, which is the one we're after, is 7 steps away, and that makes that interval a seventh. These are a couple of notes which use flats, doesn't matter about that. We'll look for the lowest note. Here it is here. This is a B flat. This is an E flat. So we've got a B, we've got an E. We're calling the lowest note number 1. So B's 1, C's 2, D's 3, E's 4. That's why that interval is a fourth. these two here. Again, a flat there, doesn't matter about that. So we're looking for the lowest of the two, which is this one. We know that's a G, that's going to be number 1. This is an E flat or an E. We're going to count from G until we reach the E. So G's 1, A's 2, B's 3, C's 4, D's 5, E is 6. That's why that interval is a 6th.